Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Foreign Correspondent Club of Thailand, to our earlier lunchtime talk for today. My name is, of course, Panu Wongchaum. I'm the senior correspondent for Reuters and current vice president of the FCCT. Today we have, it's our privilege and honor to be welcoming Mr. George Yeo, former foreign minister of Singapore, and a very well-known statesman in Southeast Asia. George Yeo is an astute observer of international relations and regional politics, having served as Singapore foreign minister between 2004 to 2011, and among his 23 years of public service, in the Singapore government overall. His books, three books, if I shall mention, Musing, it came about from his conversation with the writer Woon Tai Ho, where he muses over a variety of issues ranging from his identity, life, to history, to Singapore, to the region and geopolitics. In his reflection, it's very interesting, and I had a chance to read through it over the past month. There's a lot in it about ASEAN, there's a lot in it about this region, where its future lies, and also his reflection on larger role of ASEAN in this landscape, global landscape that is ever changing. So without further ado, I would like to hand it over to George Yeo to speak briefly about, I guess, his book and his views about the region and so on. And then after that, we'll have a chance for some Q&A. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, his books are available at our office, so you can purchase them, and hopefully we have some time where the former minister can sign them. Thank you. Joshua, please, sir.
Thank you, Panu, for having me here at the FCC. I want to also thank George McCloyd for inviting me here many months ago, before I even thought about launching my books in Bangkok. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. I'm taking advantage of the fact that a company of which I'm a board member is having an offsite meeting. And since I'm here, why not meet old friends and new friends, and to call on old friends. I was Minister for Information and the Arts for 9 years, and had the honor and pleasure of working with journalists during that period, both locally and those who were deployed in Singapore, and also to work with the international media. It was not always an easy relationship because we were insistent on certain codes of behavior, but in the end we were fair. And even though we had run-ins with the Far East Economic Review, Asia Wall Street Journal, The Economist, in the end, the people I dealt with, some of them have become lifelong friends. Just last year, we were in Princeton, my whole family, to have lunch with Peter Khan and Karen Ellert House. They, of course, once owned the Asia Wall Street Journal, or they still do, CNBC, and Far East Economic Review. It's always a pleasure to come back to Thailand, which I think no one does not delight in coming, because of the people, its culture, the food, the climate, the beaches, and many other things besides. When I was with Robert Kwok in Hong Kong, we still have large operations in Thailand. We run the port, Lem Chabang, which was started as a sugar port by Robert Kwok a long, long time ago. And then when I was chairman of Carry Logistics, Carry Express became a household name throughout Thailand. And I'm so happy to see my colleagues here from Carrier Express. For Singapore, Thailand has always been an old friend. Outside the old Parliament House was a visit by Chulalongkorn in 1871. If you go there, you still see Thai tourists taking pictures against the little memorial with an elephant on top, recording his historic visit. My father used to bank with Bangkok Bank, and sometimes I would do the checks on his behalf. It was an old bank. And Robert Kwok, when he was in Singapore, talked about how one day when the old chairman, Apia, Teochew gentlemen came, this long line of Teochew merchants lining up in the airport to receive him, and Robert Kwok, being a newcomer and being Hock Chew and not Teochew, was standing at the end of the line. Apia wanted to visit Robert Kwok in his office, even though Robert Kwok said he should call on him. But in his book, Robert Kwok wrote that the reason why Apia wanted to see him in his office was to understand the kind of person Robert Kwok was, you know? I mean, was he drinking whiskey? Was it luxurious? What was the credit risk? Swan Aoyang, whose father was our first ambassador to Singapore, Chi Aoyang, he wrote a book about his father and about banking in the old days, which was about risk assessment. Not dashboards and numbers and alphas and betas, but looking at a person, watching the context in which he lives, he eats, he interacts, and deciding, is he serious? Is he a good risk? Then Walter Reed automated the back room, made it an important part of banking. And today, when you meet young bankers, you think that banking is about systems, not about human beings. And I think this will one day be the downfall of the global financial system, that we forget that in the end, risk is about human beings and how they look at the world. But these are just random thoughts which come to my mind when I see all of you, and in this context of meeting here in Bangkok. ASEAN, in a sense, is Bangkok writ large. Because here, the mandalas of East Asia, South and West Asia, and the West overlap. Overlap in all 10 countries of ASEAN, but with varying intensities. But here in Thailand, it's with equal intensity. South and West Asia, East Asia, and the West. Which is why no one feels unwelcome in Bangkok, in Thailand. It makes it a very, very special place. And here is a country which avoided being colonized by working with larger powers, sometimes submitting to them, but always, like Italian pasta, with a core inside, which will not fully give in. El dente. Yes, you bend with the forces, but you're still yourself. And that was how Thailand maintained its independence all these years. And all of us in ASEAN are learning the Thai trick of bending with external forces, but still within ourselves maintaining a core, which is our own sense of self and self-identity. We are now entering a world where all the pieces are moving in very troubling ways and in uncertain ways. The re-arrival of Trump refocuses our mind on all these key changes happening in the world. he promised to end the war in Ukraine within a day. I think McGregor said he can. No, Jeffrey Sachs said he can if he acknowledges that Ukraine will be neutral and will not join NATO. Then the war will end, because that was the reason for the war in the first place. I mean, whether or not that's justified is a separate question. But in Putin's mind, that was the reason for his special operation. The war in the Middle East is beyond the power of ordinary mortals to resolve in the short term. I remember Kissinger writing, if there were an easy solution, it would have been found a long time ago. So there's no easy solution. And therefore, there is no short-term solution. There's only a long-term approach. And anybody in authority can only hope to move forces in a direction which may one day, years from now, find solution. For us in Asia, these are distant wars. And for China, well, I wouldn't put it this way, but for China, it may even be an unintended good thing, because it has taken American attention away from this part of the world. On October the 10th, the celebration of the 1911 Revolution, which is Taiwan's National Day, Lai Ching-te gave a speech in which certain sentences were offensive to China. So China organized a naval exercise which blockaded Taiwan at a time when there was not a single aircraft carrier in the Pacific, because they were all there in the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean to look after other problems. China could have walked in. But of course, China did not. Why should China want to precipitate a crisis in this part of the world when there are distant crises miring the Americans in a lot of problems elsewhere? When they say, when the enemy has made a mistake, don't interrupt him. Of course, they will come back for the inauguration. But I don't think they'll be there very long, because there are more urgent matters to attend to far away. We don't know how the world is going to change. And we cannot base our plans on a set of assumptions that it will turn one way, that things will turn one way or the other. All we can do is to posit in our minds different scenarios. If there is a new Cold War between the US and China, if there's peace in Ukraine, if there's war in Ukraine, if there's big war in the Middle East because Netanyahu succeeds in dragging the US into a war with Iran, we don't know. Then there's Trump, who is a bit of a joker in the pack. Bill Bradley, an old friend, told me, no friend of Trump, because when Bill Bradley was senator in New Jersey, Trump was running a casino in Atlantic City. In 2016, he reminded me to take Trump seriously. He said there are 4 things about Trump which have not changed since he was a young man. He's against free immigration. So he's going to build a wall. But he's going to allow many foreign workers in the US because the US needs their labor. He's against free trade. He believes that free trade without adequate safeguards leads to deindustrialization and the immiseration of sectors of the population whom in trade theory should be compensated by reallocation of the benefits, but in reality are just discarded because the advantages of free trade accumulate in a few. But he's always pro-business. So oil is liquid gold. Cheap energy is important for any economy. Too many regulations kill business and are costly. And the last thing, Trump has always been against war. Of course, he is not an easy person to negotiate with, because if he wants $1, he asks for $20. If he wants peace, he will threaten you with a nuclear attack. So under the first Trump administration, people didn't quite understand him, and maybe he didn't quite understand China. So instead of win-win, they're going to lose-lose and got stuck there. I think in the new Trump administration, the world now has a better measure of Trump, and I think Trump would have gotten a better measure of China. And he's always not disliked Putin. So despite him being very pro-Israel, I think he will not bite the bait of a war with Iran. Because if he decides to have a war with Iran, it will define Trump too. And I don't think he wants that as a legacy. It goes against all his instincts. But we can never be sure. Things can happen. In the morning when we wake up, we check our phone. Oh, nothing has happened yet. But something may happen. And one morning when we wake up from a pleasant dream, we confront a nightmare. But happily, in ASEAN, we live in a nice part of the world. If you draw a 5-hour flying radius around Bangkok, it's half the world's population. And it's a peaceful part of the world. And it's growing rapidly. And if we can maintain the peace for another generation, the economy of this, the combined economy of this part of the world will be enormous. And the rest of the world will have to follow. And it's within grasp. If US-China relations are well managed. Between India and China, in Kazan, they've closed one chapter and opened a new chapter. There's no danger that they'll get too close to one another. But there's no need for them to fight each other. And in between, playing a critical role, not by strength, but by weakness. Not by direction, but by indirection. Not by hardness, but by softness, is ASEAN. Because in the Thai way, we're al dente. We're never rigid, you know? We're always soft, moving, but maintaining our sense of self. And however the world changes, if we keep flexible without losing ourselves, we'll create a platform where others can meet, resolve some of their problems. It was not an accident that Trump met Kim Jong-un for the first 2 times in ASEAN. It's not an accident for cross-strait relations. Gu Wang, Xi Jinping, Ma Ying-jeou, both times they met in Singapore. It is not an accident that till today, the only table around which the 6 parties involved in the Korean Peninsula can sit around a table is in ASEAN. It was not an accident that the trilateral summit, Japan, Korea, Japan, first met on the sidelines of ASEAN meetings. But there's one challenge here, which is technology. technology is stratifying society. Every time there's new technology, the clever people with money, they invest, they displace workers, they amass more profits, social divisions grow. And if we are not mindful of this in every country of ASEAN, then instead of us sticking together, internally, we will break up. We can only be al dente if there's a core, and we can only have this core if there's solidarity. And this solidarity requires a certain feeling of those in the elite for those whom they have responsibility for. That when they go to the countryside, where they meet people who are in dire straits, a feeling for them, and almost a sense of moral obligation to help. It is in Buddhist culture, it's in Islamic culture, it is in Christian culture. And it is not a bad thing at all that the people in Southeast Asia remain religious. Because without that sense of moral responsibility for other human beings who may be disadvantaged by technology, then all the isms that we may profess come to nothing. But this solidarity requires us to accept diversity as a starting point. No, ASEAN is so complicated. No one in ASEAN understands all of ASEAN. No leader in ASEAN understands all of ASEAN. If you ask, say, Prabowo about the history of the Philippines, if you ask Lawrence Wong about the history of Myanmar, one about the other, it's just too complicated. There's no simple history of Southeast Asia which is not a collection, an impossible collection of disparate facts. So this diversity is an essential part of ASEAN. But what it calls from all of us who live here is a kind of an instinctual respect. Yes, we're all different. You're Filipino, you're Laotian, and on one side we have China, the other side India and Islam and the West, all larger than we are. But we live together in this remarkable part of the world, archipelagos, peninsulas, plenty of coastline, all connected by the sea, which was the original internet. So next year, in Bandung, 70th anniversary, embodying a very precious principle in international affairs, that in the multipolar world, diversity is the starting point. Not just in culture and history, but in political systems, in how we see human beings should be properly organized in families and tribes. As a starting point, but requiring from all of us mutual respect, mutual non-interference, cooperation for mutual benefit, and an acknowledgement of a common humanity. So Indonesia, when it had a nationalist movement, made a conscious decision that though it is the biggest Muslim country in the world, its first principle of statehood was the belief in one God, in Pancasila. Belief in one God, meaning that we are all brothers and sisters. Because if we acknowledge one common father, then naturally we are all brothers and sisters. And this we can accept in Southeast Asia. That when Myanmar, like snakes and ladder, have slid down the snake to the bottom again, that we continue to feel for them, to wish them well, and to help them where we can. So these are just little thoughts which suffuse the 3 volumes of Musings. in the course of my growing up, my time in the armed forces, my years in government, and subsequently in the private sector, and working over the decades with different religious groups, representing the principal religious groups in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister George Yeo. Before we go to Q&A, I got a few questions, and most of these are from our members who could not attend today. I think we start off with what you kind of left off, the al dente, the ASEAN, and you mentioned Myanmar falling down the ladder and all that. Myanmar now is one of the biggest tests for ASEAN, and for the last few years since the military coup, there has been very little progress that have been made, and ASEAN countries have been trying different ways. How do you see, from your experience, from your expertise, how do you see this playing out going forward? I mean, do you have any suggestion and thoughts on how do we resolve this issue in Myanmar? So.
I'm by nature a bit of an optimist, so I try to see the silver linings when there are dark clouds. The protagonists in Myanmar are all exhausted. The Tatmadaw must now know that it cannot, by force, reunify the country. It is not possible. And in some ways, the Tatmadaw has become no more than the ethnic army of the Burma people. Still the biggest, still the strongest, but not strong enough to subdue all the others. And each and every one of the others know that. They may be strong in their own ethnic enclave, but they can't dominate the others. And therefore, they work in loose coalitions. But none of them wants the country to break up. There is somehow a certain wisdom that if the country breaks up, then there'll be generations of strife. So why not live and let live? And each accept that we're different. You're Karen, you're Kachin, you're Chin, you're Kaya, you're Mon, whatever. You have your own little army, your own little rituals, carry on. You're Buddhist, you're Christian, you're Muslim. Well, we've always been Christian, Muslim, and Buddhist from as far back as we can remember. There's nothing wrong with that. We learn to live with each other. In Yangon, like in Bangkok, like in Singapore, like in Kuala Lumpur, you find the same street, a temple, a mosque, a church. Nothing to us. It's okay. We've always lived like that. All ASEAN's neighbors want the country to be at peace and for the economy to be revived. China, India, Bangladesh, Thailand, Laos. They all want that. The Americans, I'm not so sure. There are elements in America who don't want China to bypass the Straits of Malacca and have a direct corridor to South View. I've often wondered why there was so much love for the Muslims in Arakan State. If it's a love for Muslims, you see that reflected in policies elsewhere. But the love of Muslims is confined to Muslims in China and to Muslims in Myanmar. So I think there's a geopolitical aspect to some of this advocacy. I'm not referring to Americans or Westerners generally. I think they mean well for Myanmar. I'm referring to certain groups, powerful people, who worry geopolitically about the Belt and Road, who want the Straits of Malacca to be a chokehold on the Chinese. So in the region, all the countries want ASEAN to be in the lead, because if China were in the lead, the Indians would be suspicious, the Japanese, the Americans, everybody would be suspicious. India can't take the lead. Thailand talent just manages. And China has been repeatedly asking ASEAN to step up. I think we made a mistake by scolding the leaders and telling them that unless you behave, don't come into the room. In my long years in government, when the old junta was no better behaved than the better one, than the current one, we smile for the cameras, stiff smile, get them to the room, and then we give them a piece of our mind. That having been done, we kind of tighten our knots, open the doors, smile again, plastic smiles. This is ASEAN unity. We save face, because face is very important in the cultures of Southeast Asia. If we humiliate them publicly to their own people, they have to take a tough line. So I hope under President Prabowo, because Indonesia is the anchor of Southeast Asia, I hope Indonesia will take a more active role. If we don't, China will be forced to make its own arrangements with different ethnic groups, the Kokand, the Wa, the Arakan army, and so on. And India will make its own arrangements. And Thailand has always made its own arrangements. But it is suboptimal. Far better if ASEAN were to take the lead and work with all the others to help mediate some kind of a loose settlement. You will never be perfect. If we can be 5 upon 10, that's already a distinction. And our ambition should not exceed that. Because if it exceeds that, we will fail. We will not even reach 3. But if we are modest and we are patient, I think we can bring calm back to this part of the world and, in a way, help India and China, help Bangladesh reach out to one another.
Thank you, sir. Second question is on the rising of Chinese influence in Southeast Asia. You alluded through in your reflection. What's your view on sort of the increasing Chinese influence in places like Singapore and Thailand? How do we go forward with China rising, but also with the geopolitical situation being what it is right now in the world?
This is a new cycle in the history of relationship between China and Southeast Asia. And Chinese influence will grow and permeate all of Southeast Asia. What we are seeing now is, say, in a journey of 10 kilometers, we are barely at the 3-kilometer mark. About 2 months ago, I attended a meeting in Vientiane. My youngest son was with me. We took the fast train to Luang Prabang. And from Luang Prabang, we took the train to Kunming to see our Tai Chi master. I wanted to take this train. At Luang Prabang, I decided to pay a bit more money to stay in a boutique hotel by the Mekong River. And the hotel provided a free boat ride to watch the sunset, which was romantic. And then I heard coming down the river another boat blaring karaoke music. And another. So I told my son, this will be a very noisy river. It'll be a little like the Chao Phraya. There will be boats looking like Christmas trees, sailing up and down with music blaring. It's Chinese influence. It's going to be all of Southeast Asia. Vietnam, despite having historical animosity with China, decided, I think, half a year ago, to have fast train connection between Hanoi to Kunming and to Nanning. The French, when they came, they thought they could access China via the Mekong River. So Mu Ho and others, they were looking for a way up, but they couldn't find a way around the Cone Falls, which divides Cambodia from Laos. So they gave up. Then from Hanoi, the French built 2 narrow gauge railroads, one to Nanning, one to Kunming. And it's along these 2 corridors that fast trains will now be developed. Each will cost way over $10 billion US dollars. And these are investments for decades. It will change the topology of supply chain and human contact for a long, long time to come. Vietnam has taken a strategic decision to move closer to China and to put every other problems they may have within that context. The outlier now is the Philippines. Duterte was so close to China, I told my Chinese friends, it's not sustainable. The pendulum will swing back. It's swung now to the other extreme. I tell my Chinese friends, this position is also not sustainable. You will find a balance. The Filipinos think they can make use of the Americans against the Chinese. You know, this is the size of our chessboard. The geostrategic chessboard covers the floor of this room. So those who try to use the Americans against the adversary will find themselves being on the chessboard of the Americans. And it's not fun to be on the chessboard with the Americans. And the Filipinos will realize this soon enough.
Thank you, Minister. Well, I'm going to open up the floor for questions. So just the usual rule of the club, please identify yourself. Please stick to questions. Identify yourself and also who you work for. Please, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Panu. Jonathan Head from the BBC. Mr. Yeo, you probably may have forgotten this, but I do remember interviewing you, I think more than 20 years ago in Singapore. And as a younger journalist, somewhat frustrated by having to attend endless ASEAN summit meetings that never seemed to generate a news line, I asked you, what's the point of ASEAN? And you gave, I think, one of the most persuasive explanations. It was a very good one, and basically about the avoidance of conflict and he said, don't look at what we do, look at what we haven't done. But I wonder now, in the current geostrategic environment, whether the same argument holds. You've been talking a lot about ASEAN's convening ability, and that's been impressive in the past, but in many ways, ASEAN's great strengths were in the heyday of globalization, when there was a global consensus and big powers did want to talk to each other and find agreement. They found ASEAN a great place to do it and liked bringing the Southeast Asian economies on board. Today you have an ASEAN which has, for the first time, one of its member states convulsed by an existential civil war, a lack of leadership. We've seen internationally from this region for a long time, and being buffeted by this increasingly strained relationship between China and the US. And some people might argue, is ASEAN really still fit for purpose?
You know, we never vote in ASEAN. We must have about 1,000 meetings a year, and we never vote. And this is incomprehensible to the European mind, to the Western mind. How do you make decisions if you don't take a tally? What happens when we don't agree? We will listen to each other with great understanding. We say, oh, okay, let's form an experts group. Let's get the officials to study this further. Let's create a task force, and let them report to us in 3 months' time. In the meantime, we talk to one another, sometimes in the toilet, and we say, oh, what about this, what about that? And then by little, the river meanders around a hard point and turns around it. And eventually still heading towards the sea. It's unlike the Western tradition, where you vote. I was involved with the Vatican for 7 years. We sit down, interpreters, the Pope reminded us, one man, one vote, so a lay person has the same weight of voting as a cardinal. Don't be intimidated by the cardinals. And most of the time we vote. So it's okay, 7-4, 4 against, and so on. It's a Western tradition. It goes back to the beginning of Western civilization. But this is not the culture here. So we'll find a way, we'll talk. I remember the G20 meeting in Jakarta. since the Ukraine war, it has been the most successful G20 meeting. Jokowi did not force a view on anybody. He went to see Zelensky, he went to see Putin. People came. People were required by the setting to be polite to each other and to smile to one another. Because they all dressed up, with the batiks, and the music was soft. In my chapters on ASEAN, I describe ASEAN like a gamelan, There are some times where the music speeds up, appears to be reaching a climactic moment, and then it softens again, and it continues. So yes, from time to time, you have exciting notes like what we see in Myanmar today. You'll not get much worse. And there was a time when I was in the chair of ASEAN, between Thailand and Cambodia, there was almost a minor war over Preah Vihear. We were frantic. We called emergency meetings. The Indonesians sent emissaries. In the end, it calmed down. And today is just something which happened some time ago. The river flows on. Yeah. If we are still here 20 years from now, I don't think my reply would have changed. It would have changed.
Thank you. Please, Dominic.
Dominic Falder, Nikkei Asia. You were talking about consensus and solidarity within ASEAN. Min Aung Hlaing, the senior general in Burma, Myanmar, has just been put up for indictment by the International Criminal Court. I'd be interested to hear whether you believe that's a constructive move, whether that will actually help bring progress to Myanmar if the head of state de facto is criminalized. And also, if you look at ASEAN at the moment, there is only one country that's signatory to the ICC, and that is Cambodia. Singapore is not, so I would imagine that you had quite a role to play in keeping it out of the ICC.
There's a cartoon called The Wizard of It. And here the king, who's height challenged, he was on a parapet, and the peasants were below. He said, "Remember the golden rule." So the peasant said, "Oh, what is the golden rule?" "You keep the rules, I keep the gold." When Macron said that Netanyahu is not subject to ICC and protected by diplomatic immunity, then by the same rule, Min Aung Hlaing will be protected by diplomatic immunity. But of course he will not be. And Putin will not be in certain jurisdictions. My point is this, that in the end, behind every judicial system is enforcement. Enforcement means power, the ability to employ legal violence. Who provides the legal violence backing up the ICC? Is it the Security Council? No. Who? The Western powers? Lindsey Graham said, no. The ICC applies only to the others, not to us. Well, that's the Wizard of It. I think Singapore decided quite early that it's part of the show. Sometimes we are part of it, sometimes we say it's too much, we'd rather not be part of it.
Please.
I'm Asanga from Sri Lanka, based in Washington, D.C., and ICC member.
Is that Asanga? Oh,
Yes.
Hi, good to see you again. You've sprouted something.
So, ICC member at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. You mentioned a very important point on Bangladesh and China and India working together, as well as, there are a lot of crises in the region. Sri Lanka is one of them. Economic crisis, political crisis, and Bangladesh is right now facing it. Pakistan, a few days ago, the massive protests. Now, 2 days ago, I was in Cambodia attending a conference on color revolution in many countries in the region. You are correct that many countries have chosen the path of China because China is rising. I see that very clearly in the region. How do you sort of bring these two giants, India, the largest population of the world, and China together, a synergetic relation? How do you build this? You mentioned about Bandung. Will there be a Bandung moment that two great civilization countries getting together? Thank you.
A point about following in China's path. I don't think any country can follow in China's path because only the Chinese are Chinese with their history and their Confucianist tradition. What China has shown to all the rest of us is that there's more than one path into the future. There was a time when the received wisdom was, sooner or later, inevitably, all of us will have to follow in the way of the West. And now looking ahead, the Western way is itself beset with all kinds of problems. And China appears so far to be doing quite well. So maybe all of us can find our own way into the future. And that itself provides psychological relief, that I don't have to give up my tradition, the ways of my ancestors, in order to go into the future. I can still be myself, with my own sense of self, and with my own wisdom, and learning from others, find my own way to the future. The old Nigerian president, Obasanjo, who was Lee Kuan Yew's friend, and I hosted him on behalf of Lee Kuan Yew, when Lee Kuan Yew met a group of African leaders in Singapore. He's quite old now, but he's still much loved in Nigeria because he did well and he gave up power willingly. In Addis Ababa, he said, let us be very honest with ourselves that Western institutions have not worked in Africa. How can one man, one vote work when your principal affiliation is tribal? Then it becomes a game of numbers to be played by one tribe versus another tribe. So there may be a semblance of Western procedures, but it's captured. Then when the rent collection becomes too egregious, the army has to step in. And it always begins well, but it never ends well. And then another cycle of coups and restoration of democracy and coups again. We have to accept that if your principal affiliation is tribal, that strong force must be factored into the institution. And when things get out of hand, the army will have to step in, but within certain limitations. Like in Indonesia today, which is not a bad thing. I mean, look at Thailand. No Democrat in Thailand can ignore the fact of the monarchy or of the Sangha. There's a reality in Theravada society, which is also, even though you don't have a Devaraj now in Sri Lanka, it is also from the Theravada tradition. So we must all find our own way into the future. And India and China, each acknowledges that the other is an ancient people. It's almost as if they meet, they doff their hat, and they move their separate ways. India can't change China. China can't change India. And the Himalayas kept them apart from the beginning of time. There was a short border skirmish in 1962, largely forgotten in China, but which remains an open scar in India. Until today, the Indian inquiry into that war in 1962, mind you, that's 36, 62, that's over 60 years ago. The Henderson-Brooks report is still classified. Ask yourself, why does India still classify an inquiry into the origin of that war over 60 years ago? Because most Indians know that it was partly China responding to Nehru's forward policy. But the Indian press is cacophonous. And when issues are emotional, they assume a life of their own. But they got nowhere. Up there, over 5,000 meters, oxygen-deprived environment, freezing cold, precipitous geography. So they decided to pull back. And now to rebuild. It will take time. It won't be easy because there are a lot of issues. But I don't see a necessary conflict between India and China. For a time, India thought it could use the US against China. The US thought it could use India against China. But after the Ukraine war started, India became India again, which is conducting foreign policy on its own behalf. If you're in India, why not? I can sit on every table. Why should I sit only on your table? I want to sit on every table because I may like the dessert here, the main course there, the starter here, the soup there. That's India's policy. So, but Americans are saying, oh, in that case, I limit the cooperation, which I think is a more natural position. South Asia, of course, is still going through a difficult period because India is so dominant, and the history, unlike China and East Asia, is not as well formed in South Asia. It will take time. When the Indians accuse the Americans of causing the change in Bangladesh, I'm not sure if there's a whole truth. Because when I was in Bangladesh in February this year, I could sense the anger against the government and the anger against India. So you can't blame all the Americans. And if the Americans had hoped for an island in the Bay of Bengal to be a base for them, I think that's a non-starter. That's a non-starter. So South Asia will take longer. In ASEAN, we do not want to be caught up in the politics of South Asia. So if it's just Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, that's okay. But the moment you involve Pakistan, we say, no. We don't have the competence to handle such difficult problems. So let these be distant problems for those of us who live here. And for Sri Lanka and Bangladesh and Bhutan and India, by all means get closer to ASEAN. But please leave your problems behind.
Please.
It's obvious, excuse me, just working?
Please identify yourself as well, and yeah. Just
Yes, it's obvious that
your
the
name,
American-
please, sir, and then the question.
What's that?
Just tell us your name and
Matthew Rafat, Singaporean Press Club. It's obvious American democracy has failed, which means that the American political class has failed. That means we have these massive economic powers vying for power through economic statecraft. So the question is, now we have a moral leadership gap. And because of the principles of Bandung, China has always talked about non-interference. But that also leaves a wide open, I suppose, spectrum to establish a different kind of leadership not based on money. Do you think China will step up, or do you think it will hold fast to the principles of 1955? And if not China, who else?
Bandung had its antecedent the year before in the joint declaration between India and China, the joint declaration of the 5 principles, called Panchal in India. It was celebrated, the 70th anniversary was celebrated this year, but India did not participate because of bad relations with China. But I think next year in Bandung, under Indonesian chairmanship, everyone will participate. Neither India or China is a proselytizing power. They're not evangelical. The Indians have no wish to make others Indian. The Chinese have no wish to make others Chinese. And they know that they cannot be Indian, and the Indians cannot be Chinese. And the Thais will be Thais, and the Indonesians will be Indonesians. So it's okay. As a priest once told me, Catholic priest once told me, if love is conditional on the other party being like you, it's not love. Love is accepting somebody for what he or she is, not for what you want that person to be. In Southeast Asia, we take that for granted. Singapore has no desire to make Malaysia like Singapore, or the Philippines like Thailand, or Vietnam like Laos. No. Our starting point is very different. And I enjoy your food, you enjoy my food, and we learn each other's courtesies. And we give room for feelings, I mean, so maybe in a small way, we shine a light to the future for the world. How can there be peace in the world if the basis of international relations is we must all have one common set of cultural values? The relationship between man and woman, the nature of marriage, gender, caste. In India, you can't get rid of caste. Recently, I met 2 Syrian Catholics. And they were proud to tell me that when Thomas went there in the year 72 AD or something, the Apostle St. Thomas, he converted the highest Brahmins, the Nomodiri Brahmins, into Catholicism. Until today, these Catholics know that they were high caste Brahmins who converted to Catholicism. As someone said, you can't get the caste out of the Indian. In Singapore, over time, it's become muted. But with recent influx of Indians, caste consciousness has been resensitized. We can't change that in India. You've got to factor that into account when you're in India. In Singapore, we never send an Indian to be our High Commissioner because he will get entrapped in the caste dynamics. Lee Kuan Yew had a secretary. His name was Sankaran, a Tamil Brahmin. And we all knew him because he was the scribe, wrote very well. And Lee Kuan Yew told this story when he went to Delhi. He said, my Sankaran, suddenly he became a Brahmin again and started barking instructions to the Indians. Then when he came back to Singapore, he became a Singaporean again. So this is our reality. You're Iranian. I can't take the Iranian out of you. You may be Dutch, you may be Scottish. So far from wanting you to give up your past, I say, that's so interesting. But which part of Iran are you from? Are you still a Shia? And so on. Then we appreciate every gem for what it is, for its original beauty, and not try and turn every gem to be like any other gem. Then what we have are just cut stones.
Please, ma'am.
My name is Jirapon Chayasan, former journalist turned investment consultant. I just want to ask, what is your vision for ASEAN in the next 5 years? Because it seems like ASEAN, can do better in terms of promoting peace in Myanmar, and aside balancing the act between China and India and the Western powers. So I just want to ask you, what can ASEAN do better? And the second part of the question is about the Thailand and Singapore cooperation, because your Prime Minister just came to visit Thailand. And I think I just want to ask, what are some of the challenges in terms of the area of cooperation between Thailand and Singapore in the economic front, and also in other areas where you want to have a better relationship and in cooperation? Thank you.
I think somewhere in my books I had a line which says that ASEAN is held together not by love but by fear. Machiavelli had this famous line that it's better to be feared than to be loved, because love is fickle but fear is enduring. And this fear of being trampled upon by larger powers around us, I think is enduring for all of us in ASEAN. However big you are, like Indonesia, you are small compared to them. So it's better that we all huddle together and look after one another. And it requires that we care for each other, because if some countries are not doing well, like Myanmar, we are bound to be affected. In the case of Myanmar, we should be realistic and not think that there is a magic formula which can unlock all problems. But just keep things calm, support compromise, allow for a certain messiness, let people live fulfilling lives. Let the economy operate. And then gradually, the wounds will heal. But it will not happen overnight. It may take years. But that's okay. So long as it's healing and not getting worse, that's okay. But for the rest of ASEAN, we should make sure we help each other. So if Laos is a laggard, then we must help Laos. But luckily, Laos, from being landlocked, is becoming land-linked. And with this new railroad, which will eventually come down to Bangkok, I think the Laotians, being energy-rich, will do well. And already, if you go to Vientiane, to Luang Prabang, just visibly, you can see their lives have gotten better. Thailand has been a little tardy in linking up the railroad to Vientiane. When I was in Kerry Logistics, I wanted to invest in a dry port in Vientiane, but the deal fell through. But anyway, there's a dry port there now, and every day there are hundreds of trucks from Thailand going to Vientiane to be boarded onto the train going to China. And you can smell durians in the air, because China has become a gigantic market for durians, and it will continue to grow. I hope they stick to Thai durians and not go into Malaysian durians, because if they start eating Malaysian durians, we in Singapore will have a very stiff competitor. But it's wonderful. And that's the reason why we've been a little reluctant to bring in East Timor, Timor-Leste, because they're still struggling. Can you imagine if East Timor has to send delegates to 1,000 meetings a year? There'd be no one left to look after the country. So we've been telling East Timor, please look after your own internal development, very selectively decide which meetings you want to attend, don't attend most of them, and concentrate on your own internal development. And when you're ready, we've always got a place for you on board. But when you're ready, don't come before you're ready. So Singapore was the least enthusiastic about Timor-Leste joining ASEAN, because we know Lee Kuan Yew was so reluctant to establish foreign embassies, because he said, an ambassador worthy of his name will probably have much more to do in Singapore than running an embassy in some far-off land. So till today, we still have very few embassies in the world. And we have businessmen doubling up, we call them non-resident ambassadors, visiting that country twice or 3 times a year. That is all. So East Timor should be very economic. So what we need to do in ASEAN is, while we do not tax and share a common fund and quarrel over how that fund should be allocated, we should look after one another. So Singapore has always had a very generous cooperation program, training large numbers of civil servants from other countries, particularly Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, even Vietnam, and now East Timor. And we should help each other the best way we can, economically, capacity building, and feel each other's pain, as it were. No? Yeah, I think it's coming along. So yes, we were brought together by fear, not by love. But I think the fear now is softened by love. And the international meetings, in the evenings we need our rice and noodles, right? And we end up meeting ASEAN colleagues in the same restaurants. All over, in New York, in Geneva, in all the capital cities. And somehow, more and more, among students, businessmen, diplomats, civil servants, there is a growing affection and familiarity with one another.
Thank you. George.
Yes, George McLeod. I recall. I recall Lee Kuan Yew once said that his biggest worry was whether Thailand would put a canal through the Isthmus of Kra and circumvent the Malacca Straits. I was wondering if you could discuss that and whether that's still considered an issue for Singapore and a sticking point with China, seeing as how the PRC would fund such a project. Thank you.
Singapore won't like it, but Singapore can't do anything about it. It will not be the end of Singapore, and if it happens, Singapore will adjust to it. Singapore exists by arbitrage. We are where you can sell dearer, buy cheaper, go through faster, get lower interest rates. And any advantage we have is temporary, because why should others go through us if they can go direct? When China agreed to help Cambodia build a canal from Phnom Penh to Sihanouk View, the Vietnamese were not happy. I remember Hun Sen saying, how can you prevent me from breathing through my own nostril? That's a fair point. So if China wants it, if Thailand wants it, it's economic, how can Singapore have a say on this? It's expensive. Years ago, they talked about building the canal using small nuclear bombs. The futurologist, I can't remember his name now, in the 70s, talked about this in Singapore. It's much cheaper now, and for the Chinese, it's nothing. The question for Thailand is, will it create a psychological barrier between the Buddhist North and the Muslim South? And I think if there's a reason why the Thais are careful about doing this, is the fear that it will create a sense of separateness, cutting right across the Crab Isthmus. But it's for the Thais to decide. For the Chinese, it's a very old statecraft. These are your heart's desires, I'm open to them. These are your heart's desires, I'm open to them. You want a canal linking A to B, let's talk about it. You want to cut an isthmus, let's talk about it. And there are many irons in the fire. And that's how they keep each other competing for their favor. So when the Vietnamese are reluctant to link up by road rail, they went through Thailand. They went through Laos and Thailand and Myanmar. But Myanmar is now a blockage, it's okay. Now it's clearing through Thailand and Vietnam. That's how they play it. They play all sides. And they always ask you, what are your desires? Let us try to meet them and make us compete with one another. It's an old statecraft. They're very good at this. No one can have an exclusive relationship with China.
I guess last question from our member, a Singaporean member of the FCCT who sent me this question. It's a more domestic focus. It's look at the questions about Singapore's narcotics policy and its death penalty. Thailand has recently sort of relaxed its rule on cannabis, for example. Do you see any changes to Singapore's approach to narcotics in that sense?
Kung Kletcher, hello. Yeah. My old colleague from Carrier Logistics in Thailand, old friend. I think Singapore will remain tough because we are a hub, and every day people are moving in and out. And if a hub has not got good antiviral qualities, it easily becomes contaminated. For example, we have legal prostitution in Singapore. The Chinese, when they visit Singapore, they're shocked. You say, you mean prostitution is legal in Singapore? I say, yes, it is. In many countries, prostitution is illegal. But in these countries, prostitution is a much bigger problem. So sometimes, if you want to manage a problem, you have to recognize it and then put boundaries around it. In the case of drugs, if we are not careful, we become a hub. And we should contaminate not only us, but everybody else. When South Vietnam fell to the north in 1975, the heroin traffickers lost a huge market. And they tried to offload to Singaporeans. And we found in 2 years a huge increase in heroin sales in Singapore. and it threatened to destroy an entire generation. So we decided we had to put a stop to it. We tightened our rules. Beyond a certain quantity, you're assumed to be trafficker. It's for you now to prove that you're not a trafficker. And in the military camps, because we're national service, by random lot, you will be told in the morning, all camp gates locked. Every soldier subject to urine test. You are found positive, 2 samples positive, straight into the locker. Cold turkey. In 1 year, we stopped this problem in its tracks. So when you talk to Singaporeans about human rights and about being too draconian, from our own experience, we know that tough policies work. And they save generations. But it's worked for us. It doesn't mean that it'll work for others. So in America, some states are more relaxed than others. So okay, you can study the pluses and minuses. Thailand has always been a more relaxed jurisdiction for all kinds of things, which is one reason why many people like to come to Thailand. but no, our approach is, well, good luck to you. And if you stumble onto good solutions, then we should learn from you. But if you have walked into a hole, we should also learn from you. But Singapore does not want to be a trailblazer in this regard.
Well, thank you, Mr. George Yeo, for your excellent talk and answering all our questions. As I mentioned to all of you, ladies and gentlemen, we have these books, Musings, on sale at the front. So I would like to take this opportunity to formally, on behalf of the Foreign Correspondent Club of Thailand, thank you, former Foreign Minister George Yeo, for being here today. I think we all learned a lot. And as I said, if you buy his book, maybe he'll sign you. Thank you very much, sir. Take care. Thank you. Do you mind taking a photo here? We got some gift for you as well.
Oh, sure. Yes, of course.
And Dominic, you want to come?